Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to the 8th webinar that we have been hosting every week for us to gather together, inshallah. I am Ismahan Abdullahi and I serve as the Mass-Paced Director. I have my fellow co-host with me, Sister Wafam Manasra. And we're gonna go ahead and get started, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. It is an honor to host all of you again. We would like to thank our partners who have been doing this work year-round, American Muslims for Palestine, as well as our other partners as well, Muna, CARE, USCMO, and ICNA, MLFA, Mercy Without Limits, AMCF, Al-Maghrib, and countless others who continue to be in partnership with us as we kind of come together on a weekly basis to continue to make sure that we keep this struggle alive. We're connecting ourselves back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, connecting back to the history, and making sure that we're not just grounding ourselves spiritually and increasing in our knowledge, being able to have access to the resources developed by our amazing partners, but also that we are coming together to take action as well, inshallah. Today we are joined by our dear brother, Dr. Hatem Bizian. And before he gets started, inshallah, I'm going to hand it off to my co-host, Wafam Manasra, inshallah, and she will kind of give us a little bit of background on what to expect today.
Jazakallah khair, Ismahan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. Just a few reminders that we will share the link to this live streaming, and it will be the same link that will serve as a recording so that you could share it with others. Inshallah, that will be in the chat box shortly. Just a few housekeeping guidelines before I start with the Quran is to just remind folks to use the Q&A feature within Zoom to ask questions. Anything that's in the chat box will be more for social networking and connectivity. We will open that up right now. But if you could just keep your questions to the Q&A feature within Zoom. Lastly, we ask that you note down our resources, but if you can't get to it, if you can't find a way to save it, it's not letting you copy paste, don't worry, inshallah, we will email registrants all the resources as well so that you have it in your inbox. Bi'idhnillah. I want to have something unique to share with the audience today. Usually we have a guest qari that will allow us to utilize different community members to recite the Quran, but today we felt that it was very important to use a recitation from a dear youth in Gaza. So that will be our recitation today.
الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض ما ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Wafa. And next we're going to move on to our dear speaker, Dr. Hatem Bizian, who is going to ground us. It's important for us to know the history of Palestine and kind of dive into this a little bit more deeply. And of course, the intersections of Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian sentiments that we've been seeing here in the States and how that is connected to the history of what happened in Palestine as well. So we know Dr. Hatem Bizian very well. He needs no introduction, but I think it's really important for us to read his bio to really appreciate the wealth of knowledge that he brings to the table. May Allah bless him. Dr. Hatem Bizian is a scholar of religion, politics, and globalization, whose field specialties include Islamic law, Awqaf and Fatawa texts, classical Arabic, Palestine, Islamophobia, diaspora, and comparative immigration, American law and society, Arab and Arab American studies, race theory and history, colonialism, post-colonial and decolonial studies, ethnic studies, multicultural and cross-cultural studies, international relations and globalization, social and political movement, comparative liberation theologies, languages, and media. And he's a professor in the Department of Near Eastern Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, an advisor to the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Center there. And prior to his post at Zaytuna College, he taught at UC Berkeley School of Law, UC Davis, San Francisco State University, Graduate Theological Union, St. Mary's College, and Diablo Valley College. Dr. Bazian earned his PhD at UC Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies in 2000. His PhD thesis, titled Al-Quds in Islamic Consciousness, a textual survey of Muslim claims and rights to the sacred city, contributes to a better understanding of Muslim attachment and informed political attitudes toward the sacred city of Jerusalem and Palestine in general. And we are honored that you could join us today, Dr. Bazian. Inshallah, we'll hand over the floor to you. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala khair al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'd like to thank you for both the introduction as well as having this important gathering for us at this critical time. I would like maybe first to go through some of the early history of Palestine and then focus on the latter years, specifically post-Oslo Agreement, in order for us to understand the contemporary period. So to begin with, Palestine is one of the oldest regions in the world. So much so that when we speak about what is the oldest city in the world, it's actually often is spoken of to be Damascus as the oldest continuously inhabited city. But the oldest place where a human being developed a city is the city of Jericho, or Ariha, in the Jordan Valley. And that, in essence, is the first place where we have human beings actually developing a city and a type of sedentary living. Archaeologists are almost in consensus on that point. And then if we speak about the region in general, this is the region where what we call the birthplace of civilization, whether it's Mesopotamia, the Bilad al-Sham, the Fertile Crescent, or the Nile Valley in Egypt. Then we also speak about India and China. Second point on this, the oldest olive tree in the world today is still in Palestine. Some put the estimate of it to be 8,000 years. Some would actually put it much later at 6,000, but between 5,000 to 8,000 years is the date of the oldest olive tree in the world, and that is also in Palestine. It is a place where it has had the agricultural development of agriculture, domestication of animals, creating canals for irrigation. Even the early development of language and alphabet also could be dated in there. That's no longer, again, it's no longer disputed in any way by archaeologists. So there's a lot of things that could be subject to arguments or discussion, but in general, this is almost an acceptable base of knowledge in general. If we think about who are the oldest populations to have lived in Palestine, again, undisputed that the earliest inhabitants of this land are people that are all called the Canaanites. It's actually an Arabic term, Al-Kan'aniyun. The Canaanites are the oldest population, and even if we think about the biblical text, Old Text, it refers back to the land of the Canaanites. The Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, who originated from Iraq or Mesopotamia, migrated to the land of the Canaanites. The biblical text speaks, he spoke the language of the Canaanites. He lived as an alien among the Canaanites. And even when he arrived in this area, he met the king of the Canaanites in there. So that's, again, is disputed in relations to the oldest population. Often there's an attempt to privilege only later text, meaning privileging only the biblical narrative. And the biblical narrative, whether you date it in 1000 BC or a little bit earlier or later, that cuts close to 12,000 years out of the history of the region. So there's a problem in using that reference and dating it. So many people begin to use that as a historical reference rather than looking at archaeological research, even though that archaeology of 18th, 19th century was predominantly done with a Orientalist, often colonial paradigm, and up to the 1970s, the field of archaeology, anthropology, and others were marked by Orientalist outlook, facilitating and helping colonization. But nevertheless, that the research in archaeology, the research that have developed thereafter points to this long history in Palestine. So we need to actually often, when people speak, we need to say what vantage point, which set of either texts or what set of historical material we are using. Most people, including again most of the Zionists, who ironically, Zionism started as a secular atheist movement that did not have a belief in God, or at least did not center itself with the belief of God, but nevertheless believed that God promised them the land, which is again is a contradiction in there. So we need to find out what is the vantage point of departure that people use. If it's the biblical text, then we could actually begin to understand where this reference is actually erasing close to 12,000 years of history of the Canaanites, which is one of the main components of the early inhabitants of Palestine, and then moving to the period thereafter. So that's a very important grounding point, is actually to insist, right? We need to insist on Palestinian history that is driven by the land itself and the population that lived in it pre-arrival of whether the period of Abraham alayhi salam, or at a later point with the arrival of the descendants of Musa alayhi salam, which is at a later point rather than earlier. This is not to look or examine the significance of the religious text, but the religious text should not be used as a way to silence the history that existed in a much, much earlier period than this. So this is again very important in this way. Now the third point is history always privileges written text, and one way to think of it is in relations to indigenous peoples in the Americas today. The fact that we don't have a written text from the indigenous people, most of what we know about the indigenous people is written by the settler colonialists that arrived and committed genocide against them. Similarly, again, which is on a positive side, some of our Black communities that arrived in here in enslavement, actually we do have a written text from them, mostly in Arabic. So we could actually reference to their experience, especially Umar ibn Sa'id biography, Ayub bin Sulaiman, who wrote his biography. So history privileges written text. So in this sense, the fact that religious text was written, the biblical text, both Old Testament and New Testament, makes the ability to look at earlier history very difficult, and that's why we heavily depend on archaeology for navigating some earlier history of Palestine, and it becomes an important. I think Keith Whitelam, The Inventing of Ancient Israel, is a very important book, because that invention likewise takes place in order to narrate a particular history in that way, to privilege a particular narration that almost corresponds to what Zionism wanted to do and wanted to undertake. Now, I want to jump into the period of the 19th century and in the 20th century. Zionism is born in the late 19th century. The idea of reconstituting or creating a Jewish state was a preoccupation first and foremost by Christian theologians of the West. So it's very important. Even when we speak about Napoleon, arriving into Egypt in 1798, he actually wrote and invited the Jews of the East to support his campaign with the offer or with the idea that he will reconstitute the Jews into Palestine. They rebuffed him, but that was present in relations to this idea of reconstituting the Jews to Israel, or to reconstituting Jews to Palestine, to call it Israel, as a stepping stone for what they considered to be forcing the hand of God for the end of times. And that was Christian theologians that were actually pushing this idea, motivated by theologically, but for Great Britain and the others were motivated purely by colonial consideration. So Zionism, very important for us to understand, was born within the Western world and a child of Western epistemology, and also born within the colonial era and the colonial period within Western thought. Now, the fact that it took a nationalist undertaking is also could be added, but the 19th century was the high season of European colonization. Most of the world was colonized at that point, and it's critical that 1884 we have the Paris Conference to divvy up Africa between the European powers, and Africa became a colony, north, south, east, west. Only a small area around Ethiopia and a small area around Liberia that actually ends up not being a colony, but all of Africa was divvied up. Zionism is born around that same time period. Just before the Paris Conference, we begin to have the first initial settlements in Palestine. So early settlements, 1876, that the settlements begin to take shape with the idea of colonization supported by European powers for their own purposes. It is not surprising that the discourse from early on of Zionism was a colonial discourse. And I reference an important letter that is written by Herzl to Cecil Rhodes. He actually writes a letter, appears in his the collection of his memoirs. In essence, says, "Why do I turn to you in such a matter?" He's writing to Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was the Minister of Colonies of Britain at the time. He says, because it is something colonial. So Herzl was speaking in colonial terms. Cecil Rhodes, for those who don't know, was the Minister of Colonies of Great Britain at the time. And he had the temerity to have a country named on his behalf. The country is Rhodesia, which gained its independence in the early 70s and became called Zimbabwe. So literally, Cecil Rhodes, who was Minister of Colony, he was actually wanted to create a road from South Africa all the way to Cairo. It was that type of epistemology that informed Zionism and wanted to shape the conquest of Palestine and take over Palestine with a colonial outlook. Now, for the British had their own interest. The British were looking at securing their loot from India. The British were the colonial power in India. By 1882, they were the colonial power in Egypt, which included also the campaign later on to take over Sudan. And the British were concerned about their trade and the resources that were taken out of India. The British took about close to $45 trillion worth of wealth out of India. When they arrived in India, India was 24% of the global GDP. By the time they left, it was reduced to 3%. And in 1869, they opened the Suez Canal. So they thought of a buffer state. And even the idea or the concept of Middle East is born out of British thinking of how to secure their trade and their pillaging of resources from India. So the concept of Middle East developed out of the India British office, having already have the Far East and the Middle East and the Near East. And that's how the plan for all the resources and all of their trade was passing through the Suez Canal. So even as we speak today, the United States is rallying countries, around 38 countries, to try to protect the Bab el-Mandeb at the south with Yemen, because that accounts for 16% of the global trade passes through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal. So it's a very, very important strategic point. So the British wanted a buffer state to protect the Suez Canal. But the second part of that is deep anti-Semitism that were present in not only in Great Britain, but across Europe. The Europeans have always anti-Semitic and continue to be so. So it was even Balfour himself, who issued the Balfour Declaration, was deeply an anti-Semitic person. He had expressed time and time again, complaining about the number of Jews that were present in the UK. And in Europe, there were two questions that were part of the two racist questions, we may say. One was the Jewish question, meaning the anti-Semitism. And the second is the Eastern questions, which is the Muslim questions and the Ottomans. And that's why the Ottomans were seen as the sick man of Europe. So the British, in developing and incubating Zionism, were thinking strategically of their own interests, striking not two birds with one stone, but trying to have two camels with one jockey, in this sense, being the British, in that sense, securing their trade and then putting the Jewish population in Palestine, which I may say that when the British arrived in Palestine during World War I, they actually framed their campaign within a crusading terminology. They referenced the Crusades. This is the end of the Crusades. This is coming back to Palestine after 672 years of Muslim control. So that dynamic has to be understood if what the British motivation in arriving or in incubating Palestine as a settler colony for Zionism, and Zionism becoming a junior partner with the British. So the British adopt Zionism, and they begin to actually strategize and work to implement it. And that's what gets us into the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is an agreement that is struck between the British and the French to divvy up territories that belongs to the Ottomans. These territories includes what we call the Syrian Peninsula. It includes Iraq, includes even part of the coastal areas all the way to Yemen. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement divvied up, in particular, Iraq and the Fertile Crescent. Part of it is to be delineated to be to the French, and part of it is to be delineated to be for the British. In the build-up to both World War I and to the outcome of World War I, they also struck a deal with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Sharif Hussein of Mecca was recruited into the British campaign in order for him to launch a revolt against the Ottomans. This what came to be called as the Great Arab Revolt in the language of those who benefited from it. But in general, I always say the Great Arab Revolt was not great, nor was it Arab. It was T.E. Lawrence, a British intelligence officer that was operating out of the Cairo office. He came with the idea of fomenting an Arab rebellion in the southern Ottoman provinces in order to disrupt the supply route of the Ottoman army, in order to allow for the British forces to come out of Egypt and to land from the Mediterranean. The other part is also they needed Sharif Hussein because of his legitimacy, being an Arab descendant of the Prophet ﷺ family. The reason is that both the French and the British armies had large Muslim troops were recruited from the colonies. Right? So these were colonial troops in the hundreds of thousands that were recruited across World War I. We failed to recognize this. So many of the troops were hesitant to fight against the Ottomans, who were representing and holding the flag bearer of the Muslim world. And therefore, the British made a promise in correspondence between Sharif Hussein and McMahon of the British Foreign Office that the British will actually declare Sharif Hussein to be the new caliph. I know if people think that Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd is actually in the Muslim world, in Mecca or in Cairo. It seems that Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd were sitting in London drinking afternoon tea, so they could appoint who's going to be the Khalifa or not. Not dissimilar to what happens today in across many parts. But the end of the story is this campaign by Sharif Hussein ended up allowing the British to occupy Palestine. There's an important dating in here that has to be understood. The Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917. The British entered and occupied Palestine in terms of date at December 10th or 11th, 1917. Meaning the Balfour Declaration was issued at a time where the British were not the sovereign or the occupying power of Palestine. They gave a land that does not belong to them, nor they had the authority to dispense of Palestine in any way or shape, even after they arrived. That's a very important, because the Balfour Declaration that is issued becomes the instrument by which the entry of a creation of a Zionist Jewish state into the body of public international law. The Balfour Declarations get to be incorporated in almost every agreement thereafter. And the Palestinians are not mentioned at all in the Balfour. Their only characteristic is the non-Jewish communities, and only their civil and religious rights are to be respected, meaning no political rights. So 97% of the population in Palestine were completely erased by the Balfour Declaration, and the creation of a Jewish homeland is articulated by the Balfour Declaration, which was a private letter. It's an official British promise, but a private letter that is sent to Rothschild to convey to the Zionist movement. So that's a very important dating of November 2nd, the Balfour Declaration. The British entry into Palestine is December 10th or 11th of 1917. Balfour Declaration gets to be incorporated into the Paris Peace Conference, the settlements of post-World War claims. Woodrow Wilson accepts the recognition of the Balfour Declaration, even though that people were saying President Wilson declared the 14 points of self-determinations and the new era, while domestically he was weakened and began to actually trudge and embrace some of the most pernicious aspects of the U.S. Racial discourse. He actually hosted the KKK, the viewing of The Birth of a Nation in the White House, which was one of the first full feature films, and began to embrace KKK types of white supremacy. But he accepted the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was also incorporated into the 1922 League of Nations mandate, thus allowing the British, who were given the mandate authority over Palestine, to begin to incubate a state within a state, meaning that it gave recognition to the mandate authority in Palestine to see to it the empowerment of the newly arriving Zionist settlers over Palestine. The main component of that initial aspect is what's called the Jewish Legion. In World War I, the British actually constituted a Jewish Legion that was allowed to participate as a unit in their Eastern Front, which meaning Palestine area. Once World War I concluded and the Paris Peace Conference concluded, that legion was maintained and incorporated into the mandate power authority in Palestine. That legion becomes the nucleus for the development of the Israeli army later on, because it is one that is trained, developed, given all the resources from the British during World War I, and maintained as part of the nucleus for the empowerment of the Zionists in Palestine. During the mandate, which lasts from 1922, 1917 to 22, the British are a colonial, not a colonial power, and then 1922 League of Nations gives them this cover of legitimacy under international legal structures, which was, for me, it was what you call the new and improved colonization, because the era of colonization was coming to an end. So they needed a new and improved, just like when you go and shop for a new shampoo, you say a new and improved version. So the new and improved version of colonization was to use the terminology of mandate, maintaining colonized population under the same colonial regime while using this euphemism of mandate. So from 1922 to 1948, it is the incubation period of the British. Now, why the British needed this period? Because when the British entered Palestine, the Jewish population was only 3%. 97% of the population was Arab, Palestinian Muslim, Christians, and also Palestinian Jews, which is something that also gets to be erased by the European Zionist movement because they don't give recognition to them as such. So there needed a period of incubation through it. There will be an increased Zionist migration to Palestine, an economic empowerment, giving all of the major economic projects in Palestine to Zionist outfits, sometimes directly and sometimes with a Western front, in a similar way today, where Israel is often incorporated into many of the dynamics of Western countries. So you might be dealing with a Western company in the front, but in essence, it's almost intertwined with many of the Israeli companies, either direct investments or indirect influences. So that was economically empower them. Also giving them social, national standing in Palestine, incorporating them as on an equal footing with the Palestinians. Thus, the British actually faceted the Zionist movement and Zionism on the Palestinians. In here, I may just depart on a side tangent. Often we see these coinage that has written on it Palestine, both in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. That is a modern development that the British actually brought in. As the mandate was brought in 1922, the coinage that was being published or being printed for the purpose of Palestine began to incorporate Hebrew as an official language of Palestine, even though that Hebrew as a language at the time, among the Jewish Palestinians, where their predominant language was Arabic, and therefore the introduction of Hebrew as a language within Palestine correspond to that moment, as well as the council that was created gave equal footing to the newly arriving Zionist movement. This is not to say that I'm not a person that actually accepts exclusivity of language. I think all languages are manifestation of God's on the world. That from the signs of your Lord is the differences of your skin tones and your language. But in here, language was a colonial instrument in the same way that the French enforced French language on the populations in North Africa and in the colonial territories as a way to civilize. So the coinage, I see that some people say here, Palestine is written in there in Arabic, but is also written in Hebrew and English. And that is a phenomena that is an outcome of the mandate authority and thus imprinting by the British on Palestine that particular type of epistemology. Because prior to that, it was actually the Ottoman currency with Arabic being in there, being the insania. The new currency gets to be imprinted in that way. So that's part of really the incubation of Zionism. In addition, the British allowed for the settlements to have their own security forces, which means independent military militias that began to develop into terrorist militias. In particular, the Irgun and Stern gangs and the Haganah were actually in the early 1930s began to launch attacks on Palestinians. They attacked cafes, markets, attacked the railroads, and so on. So some of the early bombings that exist in Palestine is all carried out by these major Zionist gangs that are allowed to have their own force, allowed training, allowed to have weapons. And they were all using the discourse of colonization. You know, modern Zionists today are loath to the term colonization or colonialism, but all of the founding members of the Zionist enterprise, from Chaim Weizmann to Herzl himself, Jabotinsky to Ben-Gurion, to Joseph Weitz from the Jewish Agency, all were using colonial language, and all were committed to actually instrumentalizing and using violence as an instrument to get rid of the Palestinian population. The notion that Palestine was an empty land, a land without a people for a people without a land, that's a propaganda that gets to be developed both for the Western audience predominantly, but the Zionists themselves from the get-go understood that Palestine is heavily populated. It had almost every part of Palestine was claimed, so much so that when they sent their delegations to Palestine, the report came back that the bride is beautiful, but it's already betrothed, meaning that Palestine is a beautiful land and a beautiful place, but it's heavily populated, and no foot, except that it has already people living in there. So the British made it possible to actually incubate a state within a state under the mandate. And from 1922 to 1948, where the British left in 1948, on May 14th, 1948, by the time they left, Palestine had become 35%, maybe 36% Jewish population, Jewish Zionist population, and then the Palestinian population making close to 64 or 65% of the population. The planning for the Nakba, I tend to date the Nakba from 1917. And it goes into stages. 1917 is the first part of the Nakba where the British begin to dismantle the Palestinian national identity, or they are denationalized, so they become spoken of as a civil and religious community rather than a national community at a time where in the region, again, I'm not in here arguing about nationalism, but all of the region, nationalism was the framework by which a new modern nation states to emerge. Palestinians were denationalized. And while the Zionist movement actually brought in from outside as a national entity to establish a project. So Zionism, in essence, is five-seated over the Palestinians. 1917 is the beginning of the Nakba. The second part of the staging or development of the Nakba occurs in 1936 to 39, which is also the great revolt in Palestine. And in that stage, the dismantling of Palestinian civil society occurs. Much of the Palestinian leadership is sent to exile. Almost 5,000 Palestinians actually are killed during that period. The British used air bombardment against Palestinians. A large number of people arrested, and also many are sent to exile. So you'll find Palestinians in Latin America, in Chile, El Salvador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, are actually from that period being actually expelled or having to abandon their homes and lands to flee the what is taking place. So that begins the process of really setting in motion the takeover of Palestinian lands. And for the Zionists also, they developed at this period was called village files, very important. The village files where they begin to map the community, mapping the community who participated in the 1936 rebellion, who was part of a resistance movement, who is actually susceptible to be recruited as informant, who are the leaders that need to be actually pushed and killed at the time. All these village files actually gets to be developed, interestingly enough, with the support of universities that are formed at the time. So the culpability of the academic enterprise in Israel goes hand in hand from the early formation of the state. In a similar way, every colonial project that had occurred was actually anthropology was an instrument, political science was an instrument, and many practitioners in academia have their hands bloodied with the colonial enterprise. So these village files becomes an instrument during the 1947-48 period for the actual implementation of the third stage of the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians get expelled, ethnically cleansed, and 532 villages completely wiped out, 11 urban centers completely emptied of all the population. And it is that landscape, that aspect of Palestinian society that Israel is built upon the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So they benefited from acts of ethnic cleansing, acts of genocide that occurred at the time, and massacres. Many in here, some of these Zionist spokespeople, not to give them credit, I think logic is in short supply with them, but they say that we made the desert bloom, that we have created all this magnificent places and so on. The reality is, often Palestinians tell them, you took Palestine fully furnished. In a similar way that you take an Airbnb and you go and everything is there, they took Palestine fully furnished, houses furnished, vineyards, streets, every infrastructure was there. So the notion that these colonial forces and colonial societies came to an empty desert, it fits the imaginations of Eurocentricity, right? Because Eurocentricity posits anything outside of Europe is the realm of the barbarians, that they needed to be civilized, we need to bring development. I'm sorry, that is not the case. Palestine has always been civilized, been the land of milk and honey, very well developed. A railroad system was in existence, built during the Ottoman era. Movie theater, not that they are standard, movie theaters were there. They had actually a Mercedes dealership also in existence in that period. So much so when they had the Irish famine, the Palestinians actually sent food aid to the Irish during the potato famine and the Irish famine. So the notion that all of a sudden some who came from the Ukraine as settlers, or those from Poland, or those from other parts came to Palestine and transformed it into making the desert bloom, I would say the opposite. They made the paradise of Palestine into one of the most destructive environmental cases that we see in our eyes. They transformed what was beautiful into literally structures of epistemological ugliness in front of us. Like, how can you go to Palestine and see that apartheid wall that crisscrossing 600 kilometers in one way or other? How can you actually begin to look where close to 1.5 million trees have been cut just to build this monstrosity that is called the apartheid wall? How can you actually visit the Dead Sea, which almost have lost 1/3 of its water, and it's actually is going to almost go and disappear? How can you actually take a look at all of this transformation and posit it in essence that Israel is the pinnacle of civilization? Again, I don't want to take this as in a different direction, but this notion of civilizing the global South has been a foundational element within Western colonization, and Zionism is a type of Western colonization. It breathes Western epistemology. Actually, earlier today, I was just reading a quote from the president of Israel, Herzog. He says that if we don't win the war against Hamas, it will be a loss, or it will be a loss to all of Western civilization. This is the same language that we use, that the United States used in relations to Iraq. If we don't win the war, it's all of Western civilization, all Afghanistan, this place. Again, when Gandhi was told about Western civilization, he said it's a good idea. And I still think that they might, think of that idea relative to what is taking place. So the British made it possible to incubate Zionism, and Zionism committed genocide in 1948 against the Palestinians. Benny Morris, who wrote his book about the Palestinian refugee problem, admitted to the genocide. He also, in another article thereafter, he says he arrived at a justifiable ethnic cleansing or a justifiable genocide. He said that if you need to make an omelet, you have to crack eggs. That's how he justified 750,000 Palestinians being expelled, ethnically cleansed, almost 120 massacres being committed. The largest of it is Deir Yassin is seen as making an omelet, and the omelet that is being made is again the modern state of Israel with all its violence that is manifested against the Palestinians. So that's a very important, because most of the refugees in Gaza, some put the estimate at 70%. Some put the estimate at 80% of all the Gaza population are refugees that were expelled from their homes and lands in 1948. And therefore, they are looking at their homes and lands literally across the borders from Gaza, hoping and having expectation of right of return to their homes, which is also, again, United Nations says that they have the right to return. Resolution 194, passed in post-World War, post-1948 war, said that the refugees have the right to go back to their homes and lands. Israel prevented their return to their homes and lands, despite the fact that you have a resolution 194, which Israel accepted as a precondition to their admission into the United Nations. Right. So 48 is the Nakba that dismantles and dispossesses the Palestinian population. Now, 48 is also an important point. The Gaza Strip comes under Egyptian control. The West Bank comes under Jordanian control. Now, it's important, immediately after the end of 48 war, the Palestinians actually held a meeting in Gaza and declared independence. The Jordanian government at the time, with communication and relations with the Israeli government at the time, facilitated that Jordan should be involved in annexing the West Bank to prevent the Palestinian state from emerging. Because again, for Zionism, the core is actually what's called Judea and Samaria for them, which is the West Bank. So Jordan actually called for a number of Palestinian dignitaries and held a meeting in Jericho, where those dignitaries spoke on behalf of the Palestinians who already declared independence in Gaza and called for becoming to be annexed by Jordan, become part of Jordan. So that's how the West Bank becomes part of Jordan, and then Palestinians in the West Bank get the Jordanian citizenship. There's a book on collusion across the Jordan River. It's a very important book that speaks about the relationship of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Israel and Zionism. They actually agreed on that relationship as early as 1922, when Transjordan was created as a way. So from 1922, there was an acceptance by the Hashemite, who were participant in the Great Arab Revolt and got to have both Jordan as part of their reward compensation, and also King Faisal was appointed to be king in Iraq. So both Jordan and Iraq were created as a result of the British machination. Iraq, King Faisal was brought in to torpedo the Iraqi nationalist movement at the time, to implement the British designs on Iraq. So that relationship prevented a Palestinian state from emerging in 1948, after the Palestinians actually declared independence. Interestingly enough, they did not actually see it to be exclusive. They welcomed everyone that would live with the Palestinians to actually be incorporated and welcome. And if even we go much earlier, I know these days many of these Zionists try to besmirk the name of the Palestinians, defame the Palestinians by indicating that the Palestinians were in support of Nazi Germany and so on. That is, again, reductionist, because the Palestinians actually, in their literature, in their news writing and so on, in Palestine, never actually accepted Nazi Germany, nor actually celebrated or indicated their affinity, anything relative to Nazi Germany. I take account of Haj Amin al-Husseini going and meeting with Hitler. Haj Amin al-Husseini was instrumentalized by the German in order to actually pacify and recruit Bosnian Muslims into the German army. So you have many of these what you call Zionists who possibly do not read more than what the ADL or APAC send them as talking point, and they think that smart aleck that they figured it out, so they go and yell about how Hitler was inspired by Hajj Amin al-Husseini, talking about what you call the compounded ignorance of history, and also ignorance of the genesis of racism and anti-Semitism in Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe is historical. You don't need Hajj Amin al-Hussein or a Palestinian to tell the Europeans how they should be or how they have been anti-Semitic. Again, the history of Europe, there's about 1,030 pogroms that have been committed against the Jews in Europe. Right? And the history of Muslims and Jews is really, we should be talking about Judeo-Islamic tradition. Again, set Zionism aside, the history of Jewish-Muslim relations is far more robust than anything closely resembling what we call is Judeo-Christian tradition. That's only an invention post-World War II. For the history of Jewish-Christian relations is the whole series of pogroms, death and destructions visited upon the Jewish population. You could take it from the Inquisition, you could take it even the Crusades. The Crusaders, as they came out of Europe, every time they passed by a city or a town that had Jewish population, they massacred the Jewish population. You could talk about the period of the, not the pandemic, for the word is escaping, the 14th century, the plague. It was projected that God is angry with the Christians in Europe because they're allowing the Jews to live among them. So they had a whole series of pogroms directed at Jews. We don't find any of this historical moments in Muslim Arab history, and I could point to every moment of conflict that existed, but in general, there is no historical reference to these types of pogroms. So much so when, again, the Inquisition and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews in Europe, the Jews actually ended up migrating and living in the Muslim world as co-participant in the production of what we call, broadly speaking, Islamic civilization. So it's very important to remind these individuals that have reduced the Muslim Jewish history to only to speak of Muslim Palestinian Zionist history and try to project that back into history. This is actually doing disservice both to their history, to Jewish history, and also a disservice to narrating accurately the continued suffering that Jews have experienced at the hands of the Western world. And today the Western world arise as diplomats, masquerading that they are actually the ones that are going to resolve the conflict. Every time that a Western diplomat comes, they're either trying to sell you a weapon or trying to facilitate somebody else selling a weapon in order to expand their commercial economic interests. We're a military-industrial complex economy, and we need to understand that. I know I went a lot, 53 minutes. I wanted to cover maybe the latter piece, but there's a lot of history to actually get into. Maybe I could spend a few minutes. The most recent development, again, people are following the news, but if I may jump to Oslo Agreement, which is based on the notion of land for peace or a two-state solution. Oslo Agreement did not actually framed of letting go of Israel, letting go of the occupied territories. The Oslo Agreement came at the end of the first Intifada and also the end of the first Gulf War. The United States, because it rallied the Arab world to be part of its coalition against Iraq, promised that they will facilitate the peace process to unfold, and they began with the Madrid Conference. And through the Madrid Conference, negotiations were taking place. A back channel was opened between Israel and the PLO through Norway that resulted in the signing of the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement basically said that Israel will recognize the PLO as the legitimate representative to negotiate with Israel, while the PLO under Yasser Arafat recognized Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state. So again, Palestinian PLO recognized Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state. and Israel recognized the PLO to negotiate with it. The negotiations is to take 5 years to resolve long-standing issues, refugees, borders, the status of Jerusalem, water and resources, and all those are to be delayed to these 5 years of negotiation. Now, what is critical is why the Oslo Agreement failed. I wrote about it initially. It's a security agreement where the occupied people will be responsible for the protection of their occupier. At the core, Israel actually wanted to revert to classical colonization, where an indigenous population, a segment of the indigenous population will be recruited as a campadora class, and they will run the administrative affairs of the colonized population without actually giving them sovereignty. Israel did not accept to be in any part of the Oslo as being an occupied power. That's why there is no reference to occupation. And as such, this became the framework of a security structure. And when we today look at the Palestinian Authority, which is actually being responsible for securing the settlers against the Palestinians or from the Palestinians, while the settlers continue to wreak havoc among the Palestinians in there. The Oslo, even as injurious to the Palestinians, the right wing in Israel, which is represented by Netanyahu, opposed the Oslo Agreement. And I need to remind people, because often people just, especially in the United States and others, they're so much into reducing everything to Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Remind them that in 1994, during the Ramadan at that time, a medical doctor of American background, he's an American Zionist settler named Baruch Goldstein, walked into the Ibrahimi Mosque in Al Khalil during the Fajr prayer, the morning prayer, and shot 29 Palestinians dead and injured 120. Baruch Goldstein is from the Kahana movement, Kahanist. If you don't know, Ben Gavir, who's now is responsible for the security in Israel, he's a Kahanist. In his office, he had Baruch Goldstein image or photo in his office. For him, Baruch Goldstein is a hero. And his grave, Baruch Goldstein grave, is a site of visitation. This was followed in a period of actually stalking and calling Rabin, who signed the Oslo Agreement with Arafat, calling him a traitor. And during this campaign, Netanyahu was running in the election, and they actually dressed up Rabin, not that it's a point of insult, but dressed up Rabin in images on advertisement with the Palestinian kufiya like Yasser Arafat. So he was being actually called a traitor, that he is giving up the land of Israel, Greater Israel, and thus he was assassinated in 1995. That brought the peace process, even as distorted as it is, to an end. It was Netanyahu who dug the grave. He gave the right wing the oxygen. He rallied behind all of this. That's why Rabin's wife actually did not want him to be present, and literally blamed him for what happened to her husband. He was shot in Tel Aviv by a right-wing extremist, Israeli extremist, that followed that period also by the attack on Ibrahimi Mosque. And from that point, then you develop into the series of violence that occurs between Palestinians and Israel, simultaneously the expansion of settlement activity. In 1993, there was approximately 130,000 settlers in the West Bank, right? 1993. Today, as we speak, there are about 750,000 settlers in the West Bank. All these settlers have moved in there with the support of the Israeli government, with the support or the tacit silence of the US government, because the settlements have moved from being illegal in US to being only impediment to peace, to Trump is actually saying to incorporate them, or during Clinton, Clinton says whatever in the hands of Palestinians will be Palestinian, whatever in the hands of the Israelis will be Israel. So the settlement continued to expand and expand and expand, and now we have 750,000 settlers supported by the United States, supported by the Israeli government, giving incentive, with thousands of Americans who actually take off from the United States and arrive in Israel and immediately go into settlement. So especially if you think about the Kiryat Arba in Al Khalil, some of the most racist aspects of the settler community is there. Large number of them are American settlers who are in there. I just put out yesterday, I think, a post on TikTok, not Signed, that the president said that they're going to sanction the travel of settlers who are accused of violence or having incited in violence. And that's just a weak, cowardly position in the face of genocide taking place in Gaza. I said, there are many ideas that you could have. Why don't you actually clearly stand and say all settlers and settlements are illegal? Demand that these settlements have to be completely undone and stopped. Say that we will not allow any products from the settlements to be sold. Last year, when Kamala Harris and her husband were celebrating Hanukkah or Christmas, they had a bottle of wine on the table produced from the settlements. So if our vice president is actually consuming a product that is coming from an illegal settlement that contravened the 4 Geneva Convention, so why, Mr. Biden, why don't you declare that to be the case? Why don't you actually remove them from the SWIFT financial transactions, that if you are in a settlement and participate in the settlements, we're not going to allow you to partake in the SWIFT transactions. You can't actually send back and forth any type of financial resource. Why don't you actually say that any American company that sets shop in any of these illegal settlements will be subject to sanctions by the United States and will be actually subject to fines and so on? McDonald's is there, Starbucks is there, all Coca-Cola products, Burger King, and so on. So literally, Biden thinks that he could actually throw for us a bone for the Arab Muslim Palestinian community to stay, and he's celebrating, and they celebrated in the White House, celebrated in the State Department, and began to put it out in Twitter. Maybe I thought, let me stop and delay my prayer. This is such an important announcement coming from the White House. Maybe instead of going to Hajj and do tawaf in the Kaaba, I go tawaf around the White House because of this step that the president have done. So again, we need to be very clear that Oslo actually, as a security agreement, did not fulfill the basic boundaries for the Palestinians. And on top of this, I argued, again, 1993, because Israel did not admit, nor Oslo defined the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as occupied territories, it actually emboldened the settlers and the Israeli government to continue to expand and take and incorporate and take more lands, and then dividing the West Bank into 3 areas, Area A, Area B, and Area C, also was highly problematic. Now Area C, which is most of the Jordan Valley, has completely been incorporated into Israel, completely been emptied of Palestinians, making their life a living hell on a daily basis. Area B is still subject to joint control between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Area A, where most of the Palestinian Authority responsibility lies, is that where you have most of the violence that Israel directs at the Palestinians, because deep down within Israel, literally the need or the desire to see all the Palestinians out. And I want to conclude with the following in relations to understanding Palestine as a settler colonial project. Every settler colonial project have engaged in genocide and transfer. Sometimes these were done simultaneously, sometimes done in succession, sometimes they unfold over a period of time. If you think about the United States, genocide of the indigenous population took place, and then the remaining population were transferred into refugee camps, reservations, all right? And if you look at the standard of living of the reservations, / Native American refugee camps, they actually are at the lowest rung of world standards, not US. Again, they are the lowest rung. They actually would be lower what underdeveloped countries, highest rates of almost, highest rates of diabetes, highest rates of hypertension, highest rates of not diabetes, but hepatitis B in COVID, highest percentage per capita in death during COVID. And if you think about what happened in South Africa, likewise, genocide, and then transfer of the Black population into the homelands, which interestingly was one of the desired views of Sharon to replicate the South Africa model. Right. So again, of concentrating Palestinians, these cantons in Area A as we speak, and leaving all the rest of the areas for the Israeli settlers and the Israeli Zionist communities. So Palestine is faced genocide and transfer. And now in Gaza, we are seeing that Israel hoped for outcome, supported by some of the Western countries and aided and abetted by some of the Arab and Muslim countries, is to transfer the Palestinians from Gaza out. If you read Trump's plan, those ideas were being percolated. And we are seeing the discussions before the protest. Again, in the initial week after the October 7th, almost the consensus was emerging that to level Gaza, one, and the second is to actually create what you call pathway out into the Sinai Desert. And Biden, when he went to the area, he was supposed to have a meeting in Jordan that will include the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Palestinians. All intents and purposes, the discussion was that Egypt will take the Palestinians, some will go to Jordan, and in return, that the US government will find a way to pay for the Egyptian debt with participation of some of the Arab countries, including United Arab Emirates and possibly Saudi Arabia, and also find a way to forgive and pay for their Jordanian debt. That was the plan. It was completely what you call undone as a result of Israel attack on the hospital, the Anglican hospital, that scuttled and basically made people that were ready to actually come into this agreement pull back because public opinion have shifted. And I think as we put more pressure, both on the United States and globally, I think the dynamics of what the outcome will be in the immediate period will be shared by our ability to continue to organize and continue to make our voices heard. And I do think that their complete transformation of the body politic around Palestine that we're witnessing in front of our eyes. I think the boldness of people, the courageousness, the readiness not to accept the norm, and actually also overtaking or shifting the paradigm. Mainstream media is no longer leading the narrative. The narrative is being led by all of the social media, all of the informal networks that now is literally, you're talking about a completely reconfigured landscape that we're looking at. So I'm very optimistic, despite the fact that we're seeing tremendous pain being visited on the Palestinian in Gaza. We're seeing unfolded genocide. I compared it today with the images of Palestinians being stripped of their clothes. It's almost identical photos from the Bosnian genocide. So if you are aware of the Bosnian genocide that took place, it's almost identical pictures where the men are separated from the families, taken and put into trucks and transported and not to be heard of. And some of the news coming that there are some men that were lined up and shot, which is also something that happened in 1948 as well. So again, this is the period that we are in. So we need to continue to double our efforts to stop and to call for a ceasefire and rethink both our relations here domestically, but our impact on the development on the ground. So thank you. And I know that I've strung the last part, but it's a lot of material to cover. So Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Bazian. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. And I wish we had more time. SubhanAllah, I've been blessed to really hear Dr. Bazian speak about this issue. Even when I was in college, did not understand what was happening in Palestine, brainwashed myself and had to relearn history. And so one of the things that I've learned is as we're listening to these types of teachings, which is important, that we're taking this not just as something that we're sitting back and receiving, but something that we can really, really help inform our strategy and commitment to never be silent and never to be afraid to speak up about the Palestinian cause for freedom. Inshallah, Dr. Bazian, we'll take a couple of questions. There's a lot of questions, and I know we don't have all night. a couple of the questions are very similar. So we'll try to pair them up together, inshallah. So one of the first questions, we're going to hit it out of the ballpark, is when did anti-Zionism become synonymous with anti-Semitism? Since Zionism is a political ideology, why is it so difficult for the West to separate? And are the Jews raised the only people who are Semites? Are the Palestinian Semites themselves?
Well, the beginning of this discourse on trying to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism really takes shape post 1967 war in the early 70s. Need to remind people that at that point, both in the United States and also in the global South, this was the high season or high era of anti-colonial struggles. This also was the high season of what we call the non-aligned movement. This was also the high season for the civil rights movement here in the United States. If you think about the Black Panther Party, if you think about the American Indian movement, the Brown Beret, the Latino movement, the Asian empowerment with the Filipino movement, all these actually began to take a solid pro-Palestine position. And in order to begin to at least direct an attack on them, it began to label and frame any type of opposition to Israel in a stronger and a strong component by framing it as anti-Semitism. So we begin to see the writing, especially led at the time by the ADL and others, that reducing or trying to defame and tarnish the standing of people by calling them anti-Semitic. And that continued to actually develop further. Post the collapse of the Cold War, Israel also had to retool itself and began to use the language of Islamophobia, because its service and positionality in relations to the Cold War came to an end, and Israel had to redesign or reframe its utilitarian function for the United States. So it began to actually use Islamophobia and project on the Muslims to be the focal point of so-called emerging anti-Semitism. This is not to say that individuals do not express or have sometimes anti-Semitic opinions. They do, but is the projection of all Muslims, right? Putting this frame that Muslims who engage in critiquing Israel are coming from deep anti-Semitism. And I think in here, they use that as an instrument because Israel is no longer defensible on merit. You cannot defend apartheid. You cannot defend the settlements. You can't defend right now the murder of 8,000 children in Gaza and 60% of 22,000 that have been killed, either children or women, is undefensible. You cannot defend the stealing of Palestinian water, the resources, the checkpoint. So the only way for you, instead of arguing the position, you reduce everything to actually saying if you speak against Israel, then it's a form of anti-Semitism because you're rejecting the sovereignty of the Jews as a class of people, which is, again, it's a claim to say that Israel is equal to the Jewish people and the Jewish people is equal to Israel. Zionism is the foundation of Israel, and thus anyone that stands against Israel is standing against the Jewish people in its totality. It's a strategy that's being used, but I would say it's failing because a large segment of anti-Zionist activists right now are progressive Jewish communities, also Orthodox Jewish community, Notre Carta and others. So now we are actually having to contend, that especially among the young population, those from 34 and below, no longer see Israel as the focal point of their identity. So there is a shift that is taking place, but it's also an intensification of attempt to silence the critique by labeling it or putting on it the label of anti-Semitism. Lastly, I think in the United States and in Western Europe, the primary threat of anti-Semitism really comes from the white supremacists who are on what you call on an ascending trajectory. They're winning elections. The neo-Nazis are winning elections. Gerd Wilder, who actually from a neo-Nazi party, he's been to Israel 40 times. which is an ironic development in the Western world, that white supremacist neo-Nazi parties that have a deep, deep historical anti-Semitism see defense of Israel as one way to articulate their credentials of, quote, defending Western civilization against the replacement theory and so on. So it's an odd development in relations to what we're seeing, but we don't see the same type of attack, demonization, or systematic work for those who actually should be, like Gerd Wilder should not be welcomed in Israel, should be actually, if anything, arrested. His party members walked into the Dutch parliament wearing Nazi insignia, but yet he is celebrated there. When he comes to the United States, he's celebrated by some of these figures. He was provided funding by the Jewish Federation. Again, these are questions for the ADL, the Jewish Federations, and others to answer for in terms of this wide contradiction between who is to fight against anti-Semitism and what is being offered to demonize Palestinians and demonize those who advocate for Palestinian rights.
Jazakumullah khairan. The next question, based on the historical experience of Palestinians losing their land to the Israelis, do you see any basis for optimism that will not occur in Gaza and the West Bank in the present context with Israel's attempt to expel or destroy Palestinians?
I had a debate with somebody from the Israeli national security body or what. Even if Israel, let's say, assume, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, Netanyahu, tomorrow morning they say we have our dream, all the Palestinians are out. Okay, I say, okay, this is the offer, I'll take it. So where are they going to go? You're going to send them to Egypt? Is Egypt going to be a stable border? And do you think that 6 million, 7 million Palestinians in Egypt is going to resolve your issue, and all of a sudden you're going to have this paradise that you're going to create? Is untenable. Do you want to send them to Jordan? There's already about 3.5 to 4 million Palestinians. At 6 million, 7 million, 11 million really angry Palestinians because they see their land across the border. You send them to Lebanon. You couldn't hold on South Lebanon, and you had to actually withdraw. This idea that Israel can solve its problem by genocide and expulsion is no longer tenable in the 21st century. And it was already done with in the mid to late 20th century. Colonialism, again, as Frantz Fanon said, dying colonialism. We witnessed a dying colonialism. The fact that 1992, Nelson Mandela came out of 1991-92 came out of prison, and that was the end of direct colonization in Africa. And I do think that we will witness the end of colonization in Asia, and we will see the end of colonization in Palestine. Does not mean that we're not going to see more suffering. Again, as colonial power begin to lose the narrative and lose the sense of who they are, they actually become to be more violent. That's why in South Africa, the latter years were the most violent. Every colonial project will unleash massive violence, thinking that in power, they could actually resolve the contradictions. The contradictions are very constitutive. It's part of colonization epistemic itself. And for me, again, there's definitely, I said, even before this period, I said this year is going to be one of the most bloodiest, beginning in the year with the Israelis almost running shot with the Palestinians, having pogroms in Hawara, attacking worshippers in Al-Aqsa, was already violent before even October 7th. I know people say violence returned to the Holy Land, as if violence was in Greece, taking a suntan and all of a sudden showed up. This is, again, a misunderstanding that we are going to see, again, Israel unleashes all its power and violence, supported by Western countries and supported by some Arab and Muslim countries that also are vested in this Pax Americana that is in the region. And that's, I think, the Palestinians are standing, or at least one of those elements that continues to aspire and look for a different future horizon.
Jazakallah khair. We'll take maybe 2 more questions. So there seems to be a confusion about a narrative that most Palestinians actually sold their land and that they don't have any rights to the land that they sold. How valid is that claim?
That's just a bunch of garbage, and I'm sorry for garbage, because you could recycle garbage and create from it useful products. The evidence is overwhelming. I refer people to Ibrahim Abu Lughud's book, Transformation of Palestine, wrote about it. Walid al-Khalidi wrote about it. This is a convenient, what you call, claim that even in 1948, when the United Nations issued Resolution 181, the Zionist movement in Palestine had only title to only 6% of the land, meaning 94% of the land was still under the hands of the Palestinians. That's why when the expulsion took place, Israel passed a law to prohibit the return of the population and put together what's called the absentee law that allowed the Israeli government to confiscate the properties of Palestinians and then put it, and again, this is what you call sophisticated thievery and pillaging. They put the lands under the Jewish National Fund, a quasi-governmental agency. So Israel says we did not take anybody's land. It's like we are a government that does not own land. The land is actually held by the National Jewish Fund, for the exclusive use of the Jewish population. So Palestinians did not sell their land. The deeds of the lands are there. Furthermore, Israel actually, for Palestinians who remained in Israel in 48, but they happened to be in different parts of Israel at the time, either visiting or got stuck in another, they were not allowed to go back to their homes. And therefore, in Israel today, there is a class of Palestinians, they're called absentee, present absentee. They're absentee from their property, they're present in the state, so they get the Israeli citizenship, but the state considers them absentee, so their property are confiscated. It's about 200,000 of these individuals today. This claim of the Palestinians sold their land is used again, is pushed in the social media. Unfortunately, some in what you call working out of intelligence nods and pods, even some those who want to normalize with Israel as a way to cast aspirations on the Palestinians, send out this: the Palestinians sold their land. If you want evidence, just take a look at the Palestinians in Gaza. They're not going anywhere, right? They don't want to go anywhere, and they still want to go back to their lands and homes. And Israel as a society, Israel as a state has benefited from acts of genocide and acts of war crimes committed against the Palestinians. And Palestinians still see their homes, their lands, and they still hold the keys to their homes. Lastly, all the deeds of the Palestinians is still recorded in the Sharia courts, whether it's Sharia courts in Jerusalem or in Lebanon. And then the primary records are available in the Turkish Ottoman archives, the Daftarli, which is the records of the Palestinians up to the arrival of the British period. All these records are very well established. So again, this is a claim intended to say that Palestinians don't value their land and they sold it.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Bazian. So the last question, there's actually two parts. One is just the Arab countries' role in the current situation in Palestine and getting to this level. And then what would be the ideal outcome from all of this? What is the ultimate goal?
Well, one, in terms of what the Arab countries in the region, we need to actually understand that we are dealing with a post-colonial world structure and post-colonial Arab order. It's very important because people get the notion why all these Arab countries are not. These are post-colonial states. These elites were the elites that were literally nurtured, developed, educated, trained by the colonial powers. Either themselves or their children right now are the ones that are running the affairs of the society. Their role, you could say, in the same way that you have what you call a franchise, a 7-Eleven franchise, they're franchisee of the colonial epistemology. They're franchisee of the colonial structure. The economy is still colonial. The political order is colonial. The hierarchy of meaning is colonial. The racial configuration is colonial. And more importantly, the military in its training and its structure is highly colonial. Most of them are trained either in the United States, Great Britain, France, and so on. And their security is guaranteed by the colonial powers. So that begins to inform us why 57 Arab Muslim countries gather in what's called the OIC, Organization of Islamic Uncooperation. I don't call it cooperation. Organization of Islamic Uncooperation meet, and none of them was able to deliver a bottle of water collectively unless the United States and Israel permit them to do so. that tells us that the change has to take place still from the ground up. And I'm very critical also from Muslim religious leaders that, are loud on all types of issues. Like, they will go on for hours if your hijab was not put on correctly or that your ankles are showing, but they're completely silent about genocide are taking place. And then the whole discourse of adab, right? There is no adab in the face of genocide. The adab of genocide is for you to actually express the adab out in the streets and be out in there. And we see that, when you have, sermons that basically prohibit even doing dua for the people of Gaza, or arresting people that do dua, or people that post on social media, that tells you that Islam, official Islam in the state apparatus, have lost the sense of what Islam is. Islam is being articulated discursively, being articulated in the streets of people. People are beginning to understand that at the core of Islam, yes, mercy and justice, and these go hand in hand. Witnessing what is taking place in Palestine is really transforming the consciousness of people, not only in the Arab and Muslim world in terms of the streets, and but across the world. There is a notion, and I do think it has to come from a deep sense of faith, because God is Al-Adl and also Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. One has to recognize, when we see children, babies, mothers, this is at the core of mercy. Right? Again, the mother taking care of the children is the core of the mercy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim and Al-Adl, simultaneously gives us the understanding that what we are witnessing, I call it an epistemological influx point, a moment of transformation globally that we don't know. Again, you asked me the second part of what will come. I really don't know what will be the outcome, but what I am very confident is that the world has shifted, that the structures of understanding have shifted. People level of acceptance and unacceptance have shifted. I could say that the movement, not only progressive, but the movement for a different world was almost sleeping, was almost giving up. Not only in the Muslim world, but again, you had the yellow vest in France, just like the French government was able to neutralize him. You had people who were protesting Brexit, the people in Italy, or even in Spain, and so on. You could see that there's a coalescing that as a result of Palestine being that center pole of both mercy and justice simultaneously, that it brought a complete transformation for people. And it is, people are thinking about preoccupation of the end of time. And I think their preoccupation is wrong, because people focus on the end of time in the sense of Armageddon, not actually thinking that the Armageddon is not the focus, it's actually the merciful, the just is the focus. Both, I would say, Zionism and Christian dispensationalist theologians and millenarian theologians, they want the end of time. They are drum beating for what they call Armageddon, again, distorted theology, thinking that Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, will come only after we destroy the world. What an odd theological interpretation. This is actually a human being in the service of empire and the service of military-industrial complex, translating the epistemology of materialism, militarism, and racism, and projecting it to be the divine purpose. And I think many of us need to be very clear that to de-link ourselves from that type of interpretation, where we actually project power, worship of power, and worship of might and destruction, and thinking that is divine. While God permits wrong or war to take place, God does not sanction wrongdoing. And I think that's very important. So a theologian coming and speaking that God wants this, no, it's you and the F-16 producers that want this, not God. So we need to be very clear as we navigate this period, because many people, again, continue to use that voice and that language erroneously. And I do agree with Martin Luther King. Is again, I always recommend, since we're coming to January, everybody's going to dust I Have a Dream. I say, don't stop at I Have a Dream. Go and read and listen to the three evils of society: militarism, materialism, and racism, for you to understand. I think MLK was right in his analysis, and we continue to face this. And today we're dressing up with all types of theological purpose. So I'm very optimistic that we are witnessing a transformation. What will the outcome be? It all depends on our collective co-participation in birthing the world that we all are aspiring for, rather than waiting for someone else to give us. And I know Muslims say, oh, if Salah ad-Din was here. Salah ad-Din was here, he would find you busy drinking Starbucks and waiting for the foam to be hotter for you. So again, don't wait for Salah ad-Din, get up and do your work.
Beautiful way to end that. Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Hatim. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. We took up so much of your time today. May Allah bless you. And much like everyone else, I'm always learning from you as well. May Allah bless him. Keep him in your du'as, and I put his social media on the chat. I will reshare it again. It's important for us to make sure that the contents that our scholars are producing, that we're sharing it out. And making sure that others are able to benefit as well. So if you benefited anything from Dr. Hatim Bazian today, which I'm sure each and every single one of us have, please make sure you follow his accounts and reshare and interact, because we know there's a silencing of Palestinian voices and Palestinian content, and it's on us to continue to boost that content, to continue to push through that shadow ban that's happening in a lot of the social media accounts of scholars and Palestinians and others who are speaking up for the Palestinian cause. Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Bazian. Inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you.
Of course, and we'll move on with we'll move on with the rest of the program. I'm going to put on the chat a link from a lot of our partners to continue to really make sure that we're being active in calling for that permanent ceasefire. I want that to be first and foremost in our minds, as well as the previous webinars that we've had. This is the 8th webinar that we're doing. Each week we try to bring a different flavor to it, inshallah. So please take a look at those resources, whether you are a student, an employee, just being able to know your rights when it comes to encountering law enforcement, being able to sign on to the action alerts, both from American Muslims for Palestine, as well as from CARE, Empower, and a few other organizations, and rejecting funding for genocide, etc. So there's a lot of alerts and actions. Just take your time to kind of go through them. It should not take too long, as well as resources, both legal as well as if you're interested in knowing more about the BDS boycott. Again, a lot of states have these anti-BDS laws, so make sure you're checking in regards to the laws in your state, and as well as educational materials, both for children as well as co-workers, friends, classmates, etc. What kind of resources that you can utilize, inshallah. And of course, last but not least, is continuing to donate and being able to take your own individual action, which is supplicating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to pray tahajjud, and making dua, giving in charity as well. And in the link, you will see the content links for some of the places that you can donate in, as well as additional resources. Before we end, there are so many of you who sent us letters to Gaza. And so the idea behind this specific campaign is that we know our Palestinian brothers and sisters are watching both the contents on social media, as well as how folks are, responding to this current genocide. And we want to make sure that they feel uplifted. So we are asking you to write these letters of Gaza to us. We can read in these webinars, and I'm going to read a couple of them right now, as well as post them with hashtag letters to Gaza, inshallah. Like, just go ahead, ask everyone to post and say, we want our Palestinian brothers and sisters to know we are with them. We're not just resharing their content, but also sending a message to them as well, that they are in our du'as, that even though our leaders are not responding to ending this genocide, most of the leaders are not responding to ending this genocide, we are continuing to do the best that we can and strive in any way that we can for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring an end to this atrocity that we are witnessing, this genocide that has been unfolding, going on the 3rd month. Inshallah. So keep strong. The first letter we're going to read is from Sister Manal. My dear brothers and sisters of Gaza, although I am thousands of miles away from you and have never been in Palestine, my mind is filled with thoughts about you, and my heart aches because of your pain and suffering. Living abroad in the United States, I have never been prouder to say I'm a Muslim Palestinian because of you. You are the strongest and bravest of our ummah. We can only pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala privileges us with the strength and iman that He has given your mothers and fathers and children in the midst of loss, pain, and suffering, the remembrance of Allah is at the forefront of your speech and thoughts. While the rest of us complain about our daily matters, watching you has helped me understand how trivial and inconsequential these matters are. You have become my teachers by showing me what strength and iman really look like. I am sorry that the world is not doing enough for you. You are the winners and we are the losers. Inshallah, your sacrifices and martyrdom will be rewarded by Allah with an eternal place in Jannat al-Firdaus. Ameen. The next is from our sister Margaret. Bismillah. To my dear brothers and sisters in Gaza, you are our shining stars, giving light, beauty, and guidance. Your light, so bright, reaches even to places that have never seen light before, like the bottom of the ocean trenches, deep into the hills and valleys of America and beyond. Your beauty can't be covered or smothered or destroyed. It's miraculous to see even through the small cell screens. You guide with grace by your words and deeds. For the world to see, it is amazing. For you, everyday acts. You are our heroes and our shining stars. Love and prayers. Your sister Margaret. And the next letter we're going to read is from Suleiman Ali. Dear brothers and sisters in Gaza, 2 months have passed since the occupation's onslaught, and the world has been watching the atrocities taking place in your homes. Know that the Ummah is appalled to see the state of you, that the world in itself is shocked at your patience and resilience in adversity. Your steadfastness, your taqwa, your tawakkul in Allah's path is admirable. Your faith in Allah, your support and love for each other puts us to shame. The Ummah commends and salutes you for your bravery and your sacrifice, and we pray you all achieve the freedoms and rights your people so long for since a long time. May Allah heal your wounds and grant you success and give you paramount patience. We pray for you and want to help you as much as we can, but are helpless against the higher powers who fail to act. Know that not everyone is the same and that we support you. Know that we will not forgive and forget, and that everyone who is responsible will be held accountable by Allah. Your time for salvation will come soon, inshallah. Stay strong and don't lose hope. Your brother, Suleiman Ali. And the last letter we're going to read is from our dear sister Marin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters of Gaza, thousands of miles away from you, our tears taste the same as the ocean between us, martyred in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You represent each of us in body and soul, faith and hope. Subhanallah, we call out your names in our dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept them. In the darkest hour when we cannot sleep, at the crest of a rising sun towards the end of Fajr, we think of you. To the right on your shoulder, Assalamu alaikum. To the left on your shoulder, Assalamu alaikum. Never forget the eyes that watch you, parched lips on cold foreheads. You say goodbye to generations of our ummah. Inshallah, the day will come when the chains on your wrists will break, and we will all cry out, Allahu Akbar. You may not see now the thousands that have become Muslim, yet they were inspired by your strength and dignity in the face of such injustice. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you the highest levels of Jannah. Ameen. Sister Marin, Muslim since June 2023. May Allah accept from each and every single one of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from our dear brothers and sisters in Gaza and provide relief for them. As we always say, victory and help is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the striving is on us. May Allah help us to continue to be steadfast, to speak up against the injustice and the atrocities being committed against our brothers and sisters in Palestine, in Sudan, in Congo, our Uyghur brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters in Kashmir, and so many other places. May Allah Azza wa Jal keep us steadfast in this path of justice and in this path of faith. And we bid you good night. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We'll see you at next week's webinar, inshallah, Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central Time.